Metroid 2: Return of Samus is an exterminatus simulator released in 1991 for the original Game Boy. As a forewarning, I'd first like to mention that this review will spoil the entire events and contents of the game, so if you'd like to play this game for yourself, first know that it gets my full recommendation and approval, but otherwise spoilers will be imminent, and I hope you enjoy. The game is a sort of direct sequel to the original game and was developed by Nintendo R&D 1, who were responsible for the creation of Metroid 1 as well as the Game Boy itself. And having the unique familiarities with both the Game Boy's hardware strengths and limitations, as well as an affinity towards their own Metroid series, poised the team well for the creation of what is arguably one of the most atmospheric games on the platform. The Metroid series is well known today for its quiet, lonely atmosphere, but Metroid 2 managed to handily encapsulate these themes as well as evoke elements nearer to that of horror, all on the humble 160 by 144 dot matrix display. But before we dive into that, let's quickly cover the plot. So from the manual, we learn that the Metroids from the original game were artificially multiplied from a single specimen that had been hijacked by the space pirates from a research vessel that had discovered the Metroid on the planet SR-388. After the events of the first game, where Samus destroyed all the Metroids that were created on Zebes, the Galactic Federation sends another research vessel to investigate whether or not SR-388 houses any other Metroids. After hearing no response, they send a rescue crew who also fail to report back. So a heavily armed police crew is sent, and once again, no response is heard. The Galactic Federation decides to just throw their hands in the air and say, fine, let's just hire Samus to do it again. So Samus is sent to SR-388 on a mission to exterminate all Metroid life because the Galactic Federation fears that Metroids are too great a threat to the galaxy to be left alive. And apparently when the game starts, it's somehow known that there are only 39 Metroids left on the planet, so you need to travel deep down beneath the surface and wipe them all out. But surprise surprise, the Metroids are evolving and are becoming even stronger as the game goes on. And there's really not much more complex about it than that. Find and kill all the Metroids. Pretty basic, so there's nothing much that gets in the way of the simple pleasure of exploring the planet, finding upgrades, and soaking in the atmosphere, just like the original game. But the Game Boy, while still being an 8-bit system, of course isn't quite as versatile as the NES, so certain concessions had to be made to adhere to its constraints. The small screen necessitated elements needed to be blown up to be distinguishable, and so the player's field of view is considerably diminished. The memory limitations dictated that the map couldn't be as wide and sprawling as the original, and the handheld nature had to be accounted for by creating various save stations around the map in addition to a battery-based saved feature in the cartridge itself. The original grayscale coloring meant that navigating had to be made easier by creating more landmark features and dedicated zones of play to prevent a player from having to keep the entire map of the game within their own memory. It's this last point, the zones or areas of Metroid 2, which is one of the more controversial features. New areas are locked off by being flooded with what the manual describes only as dangerous liquid, and all the Metroids within the current area need to be destroyed before an earthquake is felt, which notifies a player that the liquid has been drained and they can progress. The benefit of this approach is that it makes it quite clear to a player where the next area to progress will be, since you're almost always forced to pass over the liquid-filled area on your way into the current area. So once you've killed all the Metroids beyond that point, you know exactly where to go back to in order to move on, and you won't have to guess if you may have missed anything in the previous area. The inverse opinion is that this is a bit too convenient and linear, and that a player could feel less like they're exploring the planet on their own, and more like they're just going through levels rather than one large interconnected world, and that a player should be free to explore on their own without roadblocks, except in the case of a certain upgrade being necessary to progress. And while Metroid 2 does in a sense do this, you will need to find the upgrades in an area before you're able to find all the Metroids and thus progress further. It's all on a fragmented area-by-area basis, and is less satisfying than, say, remembering a certain area you couldn't reach near the beginning, and then going back with the appropriate upgrade to find some new goodies or a new way forward, a feature which Metroid 2 does not inherit. There's virtually no reason to go back to a previous area other than to resupply your health and missiles in the newly added recharge sites. After all, in the original game, once you got the Morph Ball bombs, you had the freedom to travel to almost any other point in the map, but in Metroid 2, this freedom is severely limited. That said, I don't think that's a bad thing, and I'm pretty content with this approach given the game's objectives. The inclusion of a Metroid counter highlights that the approach of Metroid 2 is less about exploring aimlessly as in the first game, and more about tracking down and finding. And again, in accordance to the handheld nature of the system which the game runs on, a more linear area-based progression is a logical measure to translate the Metroid experience into a bite-sized format, which will be easier to appreciate from the perspective of anticipated shorter play sessions. The original game was also split up into zones, and you had some degree of freedom to explore them in any order you wanted, but there wasn't a whole lot of interconnection there either, and you really didn't know what you were looking for, so progression was less obvious, and that resulted in greater freedom of choice for what to do in a second playthrough. The inability to devise one's own creative solution for progression makes replaying Metroid 2 distinctly less enjoyable. At that point, it's less about choosing a path that you think you can do quickly or would be more interesting, and more about just knowing where everything is and getting to it as quickly as possible in a fixed sequence. As an aside, on my second playthrough I would pause the game between areas, and while I was looking at the map I would get a lot of mileage out of pretending I was being briefed about the next area and proceeded to have imaginary conversations back to HQ about how the mission was going.
HQ, this is Ground 1. The path seems to diverge here. Please advise, over.
Ground 1, scanners indicate Gamma Metroid to the right and an Alpha on the left. You'll have to go down both, but whichever way you'd like to go first is, up to you, over.
Jesus Christ, you're loud. I guess I'll go down the right first. Over.
Copy that, Ground 1. Good luck, over.
Sure, it may be kind of childish and dumb, but that's just how I like to make my own fun sometimes. But let's get back on track. Metroid 2 doubled down on the immersive first playthrough, and as a result sacrificed subsequent ones because it would be counterintuitive to try to recreate that complexity in a handheld game when they could instead use their limitations to explore a more novel approach, for better or for worse. I think for better, and to illustrate why, let's examine the beginning of the game for a bit. When you come across the first Metroid, you get to see it evolve and shed off its previous form in front of your eyes just before the fight, and afterwards its husk ominously remains on the ground. Now that you've been introduced to this concept, the game has you come across another shedded husk, but no Metroid. This should immediately flip the oh shit switch in a player's brain. The player knows that there's an evolved Metroid nearby, but they don't know where. So every moment up until you finally encounter the next Metroid is time for suspense to build up in the back of a player's mind. And the ambient soundscape of the area gives the emotional response generated by that suspense room to breathe and creep at the edges of your rationality. Now, of course, as I mentioned, this doesn't work for a second playthrough as you now know what's coming, but the same could be said of any media with an element of suspense. And of course, Metroid 2 employs other tricks and techniques to keep the air of tension alive throughout the entire game. But that's what I mean when I say a novel approach, rather than simply repeating the setup of the first game. Shifting focus to a more technical level, Metroid 2 fixes a lot of the most common complaints and annoyances from the first game. Samus can shoot while crouched and even straight downwards. Her pre-installed arsenal includes the long beam, which can shoot to the edge of the screen, the morph ball, 99 health, and 30 missiles. It's like she actually got prepared to land on a hostile alien world instead of teleporting in with nothing but a pea shooter, 30 health, and a bad attitude. The need to farm for health or missiles is lessened considerably by the existence of recharge points. Enemies also can't hurt you when you're transitioning screens because they roam a lot less and have been strategically placed far away from screen edges. Enemies also stop spawning much quicker, cued by a little noise notification, further encouraging you to just move on to look for recharge stations or other upgrades. Secrets are placed considerately with appropriate hints in the level design given to suggest their existence. You've got a novel selection of weapon upgrades that offer a player some choice for whether they'd prefer spread or penetrability over power, but let's be honest, the Spazer laser is worth holding on to just for the name alone. The other upgrades on offer incrementally increase Samus's ability to explore her environment, like the Spider Ball, which lets her crawl across walls and ceilings while in the Morph Ball. Then there's the Morph Ball Jump, which is pretty self-explanatory, and then the Space Jump, which allows Samus to effectively jump any height or distance with properly timed inputs. And let me tell you, you're definitely going to want to master it because, well, yeah. Other returning upgrades are the Screw Attack, which when combined with the Space Jump is dramatically overpowered, but it doesn't work on Metroids and you get it so late in the game that it's hardly of any use. And of course the Varia suit, which now gives Samus her trademark giant shoulder pads because they couldn't just palette swap like last time. All in all, a decent collection of old and new upgrades that are all worth looking out for. Metroid 2 clearly does its job as a sequel by learning from and fixing almost all of the mistakes made in the first game. One thing that hasn't been improved much is enemy design. Quite a large number of enemies follow the same convention of either travels along the walls, moves around side to side, up and down, or in a small circle, or sticks to the walls or floors and has some kind of projectile. They don't even give off the illusion of having some sort of intelligent behavior. On the bright side, tougher enemies towards the end of the game drop larger amounts of health and missiles to accommodate your larger capacities. But certain enemy variety can be pretty dull and their behavior is more akin to area hazards rather than living things defending their territory. The most advanced enemies being the Metroids, and as briefly mentioned before, they now come in 4 evolved forms: Alpha, Gamma, Zeta, and Omega. Each form no longer requires the Ice Beam to damage, but they do require an increasing number of missiles to destroy as they evolve. I would go so far as to say an absurd amount, but it's not like your missiles are good for much else anyway. Some may refer to the Metroids as the bosses of Metroid 2, which I find to be a tad inaccurate. They're just a single enemy type that gets stronger as the game progresses, and they don't respawn. At best, you might call them mini-bosses like Arachnus, who only shows up once but isn't much more than a surprise super enemy who goes down pretty easily. By the fact that they're constantly evolving, you can't be sure what kind you'll run into next, which is part of the game's overall tone. They get scarier and more dangerous as the game goes on, and the anxiety they induce is exactly the objective they were designed for, not to be bosses. You want to find them, but at the same time, you also kinda don't. That said, they do have some pretty awkward behaviors and motions. They're not particularly interesting fights, and I can wholeheartedly agree that their AI at least could certainly do with a bit of improvement. Much like Ridley or Kraid from the original, the fights can feel a bit random and luck-based as you madly launch missiles into their face until they die, and it's difficult to feel any flow to battle as they relentlessly stick as close as possible to you even once they gain a projectile attack. It's supposed to make them more aggressive and threatening, but it's more like that annoying kid who keeps following you around all the time asking you to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Or something. But like I said, the Metroids are used more as a device to emphasize the atmosphere of the game by virtue of the fact that you don't know what kind you'll be up against and you can't be sure where the next is lying in wait. The aforementioned oh shit switch should pretty much be on at all times. But that said, the atmosphere is equally emphasized by the game's sound design. Ooh, segue. There are many thoughtful additions, such as that of Samus's footsteps and a noise for when she turns around. Small touches like these are hardly worth mentioning if not for the fact that they are brought to the fore of a player's attention, in large part due to the minimalistic soundtrack. Metroid 2 uses silence to evoke a more natural soundscape, the little blips of noise emulating the random ambient sounds of an alien world, punctuated by the contrasting alarm-like blare when you encounter a Metroid. Some people dislike how quiet the game is, but I disagree. It seems in more recent days, in respect to when this review was written, folks have gotten a lot more tolerable to silence and the sounds of surrounding ambience within games. And while not everyone gets the same level of enjoyment from it, it's undeniably a powerful tool to sell a game's atmosphere. And Metroid 2 was already doing this in 1991 on the Game Boy. Although rather than being relaxing or calming, it's used to heighten suspense and sell the idea of a cold, uncaring environment. Samus certainly isn't having fun on this mission. It's the homeworld of a vastly dangerous species that could threaten all life in the galaxy, and she's on a mission of genocide to exterminate every last one of them all by herself. Now that's not to say that more music couldn't have been used to fit the atmosphere, but just that this is an equally valid and poignant approach that I think was well suited for the situation. An area can be devoid of any enemy presence and oppressively silent so much that the mere sight of a shedded Metroid is enough to grip a player's entire focus to that singular sense of dreaded anticipation. Metroid 2 repeatedly uses subtraction and emptiness as a theme to enhance its atmosphere. The terror does not come from what you see or hear, but from what you don't. Nearly all encounters are preceded by these shedded remains to clue you in that one is nearby, but that's by no means a guarantee, as on at least one occasion the Metroid pops up first, and then the husk is just afterwards. And other times you'll be abruptly met by the alert tone before you even have any clue that a Metroid was nearby, and now you're suddenly under attack and unprepared, leaving a player even more on edge from then on than they already were. The game starts fair and predictable, but then purposely slowly takes it away. The final areas of the game feature almost no recharge stations for either health or missiles, which can add a great amount of stress and anxiety as you battle through the ferociously difficult Omega Metroids, and your supplies dwindle more and more, leaving you to contemplate backtracking a good deal for resupply, or to push on just a little further as the Metroid counter ticks ever closer to zero.
The big difference between, we'll say, suspense and shock or surprise is that in order to get suspense, you provide the audience with a certain amount of information and leave the rest of it to their own imagination.
My old analogy of the bomb, as an example. We could be blown up this minute and the audience would get 5 seconds of shock. But if we tell them 5 minutes ahead of time, there is a bomb that's going to go off, now we get 5 minutes of suspense. Where we didn't have suspense before because the audience were in ignorance. That's a big difference.
If we try to apply Hitchcock's example here, instead of one bomb to go off in 5 minutes, we have 39 Metroids somewhere on the planet. The entire structure of the game is therefore a conduit for suspense, and the individual components are then constructed around it to magnify this basic concept, such as the quiet, empty corridors littered throughout the planet that may or may not have a Metroid waiting for you at the end. Its simplicity is in and of itself what makes its aims so evocative. The necessary information has been given to the player at the very beginning of the game, and then the game subtracts from itself until the player's imagination is able to conjure a personal emotional reaction. By consequence, a less imaginative player might end up feeling bored, but placing oneself in the proper perspective can make the experience quite engrossing. The indigenous quality of SR388 is where the elements of tension are derived. Nothing had to be added in artificially, it's all baked into the layout of the world. Towards the end of the game, normal enemies almost entirely disappear, and it's up to your interpretation why this is the case. Do they avoid going near the Metroid's nest out of fear, or are the Metroids in that area so vicious that they've already hunted everything in the area down to its now barren state? Then there's the destroyed Artifactor statue that lies just below the Queen Metroid's chamber. Is it any coincidence that this is the only destroyed statue in the game and it happens to hold the Ice Beam, the only weapon capable of making a larva Metroid vulnerable? And lastly, this final Metroid-filled nest isn't anything like the natural caves and ruins of the rest of the planet and is distinctly more advanced looking. Why is the Metroid nest situated in this laboratory-like location? Was there once an advanced civilization here and did the Metroids wipe them out? Were the Metroids created by them? Once again, these questions don't yet have answers hidden anywhere in the game. Metroid 2 uses ambiguity and the allure of the unknown to capture a player's curiosity and thereby leaves it to their imagination to fill in the gaps. The story of the Metroids is clearly much larger than what you may have initially thought, but as for the specifics, you're left to wonder. Metroid 2 didn't need several volumes of backstory and lore to accomplish this either. All they needed were a few considerately placed elements or the lack thereof that asked their own questions. As you approach this final area, you'll spot an egg up above, and then the Metroid counter suddenly, and for the very first time, goes up. You'll then come across the newly born Metroid larva, which should probably clue you into the existence of the Queen. You dispatch them the same as the first game and enter the penultimate room with one last Metroid on your counter. The soundtrack now buzzes like an emergency alarm, and you can hear the Queen crying below. This is all a wonderful introduction to the final boss that echoes the first game with an appropriate skyrocketing of tension for this final encounter. The fight with the Queen itself isn't too complicated and mostly just involves shooting her in the face with missiles, but if you're clever you can roll into a ball, travel down her throat and lay some bombs in her stomach, which will do some pretty heavy damage. There's even an escape tunnel if you feel you're not fully prepared for the fight. Eventually the Queen falls and slowly disintegrates. Samus makes her exit to encounter the egg from before, which hatches into an adorable Metroid baby. It hovers around Samus, perhaps mistaking her for its mommy. And yes, I know we all wish Samus was our mommy, but I'm afraid we have to be honest and admit that it just isn't the case. Sorry. Anyway, Samus takes pity for the baby, maybe because it doesn't register on the Metroid counter for some reason, and together they casually make their escape with the baby eating away some stuff that blocks their path. Eventually they make their way to the surface, climb into Samus's ship, the screen fades to black, roll credits. So, instead of doing another countdown escape sequence, Metroid 2 instead treats us with a relaxed escape with some non-threatening and upbeat music to allow for a moment of quiet retrospection on the events before the game comes to a close. Given that Samus can't quite bring herself to exterminate the last Metroid, the avenues of thought that could be drawn from there are endless, so this period of reflection is far from wasted, especially given that the countdown escape wasn't yet considered tradition. There are once again several endings depending on your time, with the quickest requiring you beat the game in less than 3 hours, which is really quite easy if you just know where to go and don't have to waste time exploring. And I imagine this is the case because Metroid 2 wasn't designed to accommodate that speedrun mentality of the first game, and these endings were added just as carryovers. At the top of the video, I claim that this game to be one of the most atmospheric games on the system, and continue to mention it frequently because every facet of the game was resonantly focused to achieve this. Of course, atmosphere doesn't make a game great, but the way elements work to not only create the atmosphere of the game, but also function as compelling gameplay elements, and all performing as well as they do on a tiny monochrome Game Boy screen, is certainly worth the praise. Now, I wouldn't make the argument that Metroid 2 is an underappreciated gem or even a particularly great game. I think it's a thoroughly decent game, and certainly among the higher caliber of original Game Boy games. But most essentially that it captures and embodies the precise emotional impression that it was striving for, and its unconventional approach that they dared to implement in order to achieve this is something to be admired. It's got a different heart from the original, but that doesn't make it any better or worse. Instead, it's a quintessential example of designers utilizing their limitations to the fullest as a tool to tell a story in a unique way. It's cramped, quiet, lonely, tense, exhilarating, thought-provoking, and it's on the Game Boy.
And I was like